But first, joining me now is Susan Smith, the director of For Women Scotland, the group behind that historic court ruling at the Supreme Court this week. Susan, thanks so much for joining me, not least on Easter Sunday, after what I know has been an extremely busy week for you and fellow campaigners. Now, we know what the verdict said. It said that trans women are not women and that biological women are women, and it shouldn't be said otherwise. However, now the interpretation is leading to some disagreements. We've got Baroness Faulkner, the head of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, saying that that does provide an obligation for organisations to provide single-sex spaces. But then we've got Lord Sumption, who is quite the authority on the law, saying, no, actually it doesn't. It's been over-interpreted. What's your interpretation, Susan?
We think what it means is that anything that is advertised as a space or a service or a facility for women, it has to mean that it's biological women, otherwise it becomes a mixed-sex space. So obviously it doesn't stop people providing mixed-sex facilities, but I think that it would be very difficult to argue in practice that you're going to do away with women's spaces, because of course there are some women who would then be unable to participate in public life, and they would be able to sue for discrimination based on the Equality Act. So I don't think that in practice they will be able to get, I know there's been a concern they'd get rid of women's spaces, but I don't think that could happen in practice.
I mean, I think lots of people are saying, well, because of this ruling now, we need sports bodies to say biological women are women, biological men, even if they identify as women, are not women. Therefore, we shouldn't have trans women in sport and other arenas. Do you agree with that? I mean, that was presumably the point of you taking this to court in the first place, but you're obviously going to get opposition to that. And I'll come on to somebody with a counter view in just a moment. But Susan, on that issue, is that how widely we are interpreting what happened at the Supreme Court this week?
Absolutely. And, sport was one of those areas that was covered by exceptions anyway. So it was always within the power of sporting bodies to ensure that they were kept female only. They made a choice not to. And that was part of the reason we had to get clarity about what the law said, because without it, people were getting into very convoluted legal arguments and trying to be terribly clever and as an excuse as to why they couldn't do this. But I think the good thing is that now we know the law is on the side of the women who want that space, and it will be very hard, I think, especially in sport, for them to justify opening it up to anybody, because in sport we know there is a huge physical advantage conferred by biology. That does not go away, and it's been insane that we've had to have these arguments for so long.
We're going to get on to the NHS and its lack of response to this ruling, and also actually Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, still hasn't said anything about what was decided by the Supreme Court. Before we do that, let's just listen to the sort of counter-narrative to yours. We spoke, I think Bev and Andrew actually interviewed inclusive culture expert Joanne Lockwood on this subject, and she raised the point about how she felt that this could be detrimental to the trans community. Let's just have a quick listen to that, Susan.
My worry is this will weaponise discrimination against people who are trans, and will experience further discrimination, further marginalisation, further violence, and further loss of access to living our lives freely. That's what we're worried about. That's what I'm worried about. And hopefully the government, the HRC, will provide clarity and guidance to service providers.
Does Joanne Lockwood have a point there, Susan?
Not really. I mean, we've got the clarity that was the Supreme Court ruling, was giving us that clarity. And, people like Joanne have really pushed and pushed and pushed. And they have tried to trespass across women's boundaries for a long time. Women had been accommodating for a very long time. They hadn't raised too many objections. And it was only when people really started to make our lives intolerable that we started to have to fight back. And I don't think, look, no one's in any doubt what sex Joanne Lockwood is. It's perfectly apparent when you watch that. I don't understand why that is someone who would be at risk in a men's space. And if they are at risk in a men's space, that's something that men have to start to deal with, because it shouldn't be up to women to protect men who might be vulnerable. There are plenty of men who are vulnerable for all sorts of reasons, not all of them people who identify as being trans. And we're not human shields for them. And when they talk about not being able to live their lives, they have had no sympathy for the very many women who have not been able to live their lives. They have not been able to go shopping because they can't use a mixed sex changing room. And that's especially the case perhaps for ethnic and minority religious women. They've not had any sympathy for women who've been frightened to use a rape crisis shelter because it was headed up by a biological man. They've had no sympathy for these women who've been pushed right to the fringes because of their activism. And now they're trying to pull sob stories and try to play on women's kindness. Well, we were kind for a very long time, and it got us into this mess.
It should also be pointed out that, of course, having gender reassignment surgery and identifying as trans is a protected characteristic under the original Equalities Act. Yes. Moving on, are you surprised to have not heard anything from Prime Minister Keir Starmer about this ruling?
I think a lot of politicians owe women an apology, and I think Keir Starmer is one of them. I mean, he did make some ridiculous comments about something like 1% of women who have penises.
Yes.
And I know that the Labour Party have stepped back a bit in recent times, and Keir Starmer has been conspicuously silent on it. I think a lot of politicians are afraid of some of the sorts of men that we saw out demonstrating yesterday. I think they're frightened of them, and they should be frightened of them, because a lot of them are dangerous people. I'm terrified of them. But, you know, if mothers and grandmothers and young women, we've got an enormous amount of young women starting now to speak up at universities, and these are people who are actually at risk. He's the most powerful person in the country. He needs to stop being afraid of them and start to stand up for the people who need protection.
I've just grabbed a Mail on Sunday because the front page story makes for quite interesting reading. Ministers in WhatsApp plot to defy trans ruling. This is a story about ministers like the Culture Secretary, Chris Bryant, Dame Angela Eagle, having a conversation about how they felt that Baroness Faulkner's interpretation of the ruling was, quotes, appalling, and that they need to address this with a meeting next week. It seems that some public bodies are overreacting. What's your reaction to that, Susan? Because the counter-narrative is that actually public bodies aren't reacting quickly enough. The HR advice that was never steeped in law properly needs to be torn up, that institutions need to take a different approach, etc., etc.
Yes, I mean, we have, I keep saying this, but we had already won one judicial review before we brought this one. And our last judicial review put beyond all doubt that self-identification was not lawful. And the EHRC had confirmed that. Now, obviously, there was an issue with their previous statutory guidance, which this new guidance, even ahead of the ruling, was looking to address. But it reflected that self-identification was not the basis to allow people into changing rooms at work, for example. And yet, organisations have continued with those sorts of policies. And we saw how damaging those sorts of policies were in the Sandy Peggy Tribunal, and we're seeing it for the Darlington nurses. There was never any question that either of the two individuals involved in those cases should have been in the women's changing rooms, because they didn't have GRCs as far as we're aware. So even before this ruling put everything beyond all possible doubt, those organisations were acting unlawfully. And the idea that this is an overreaction is ridiculous. It was the law. It was always the law. We've got clarity on the law. What has happened, as I said, there were organisations badly advising governments, NHS, other businesses, And the pendulum had swung so far the other way. So saying it's an overreaction, it's not. It's just bringing the situation back to normal, I think.
Susan Smith, thank you so much for your time this morning. Great to speak to you.
Thank you.